All right. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. We're very pleased to welcome you to another class session of Democracy and Disagreement. As many of you know, I'm Deborah Satz, and along with Paul Brest, I'm the faculty lead for this course, and Graham Ambrose is the TA for the class. As many of you also know, each of our 10 classes addresses a contemporary issue of policy about which people hold differing views. And each class has two immediate goals: to illuminate the issues and to do so by modeling the critical, empirically informed, respectful conversations that lie at the core of the university's mission, which is the pursuit of knowledge. We also hope, more long-term, to shed light in this course on why some degree of disagreement is an inevitable feature of a democratic society. Only dictatorships produce an outward appearance of conformity and unanimity on a wide range of issues. In democracies, for many, many different reasons, we will continue to disagree even when we're well motivated, even when we're trying to figure out the truth, because figuring out the truth is hard, and even when we settle on facts and evidence, people make different trade-offs among the values that are at stake in the different possibilities. The first part of today's and I should also say, while disagreement is a feature and not a bug then of democracies, it's hard. And it's especially hard when the stakes of the disagreement are high and there's a lot of motivation to game the system and just to win. The first part of today's class is devoted to a difficult issue. Today, the question of whether meritocracy makes America fairer and more prosperous. During the second part of the class, students have the chance to ask questions and make comments, not speeches, but comments of the sort appropriate to furthering class discussion. Of course, if you hear something this afternoon about which you disagree, you're allowed, indeed, you are encouraged to ask difficult questions of our speakers during the question and answer period. We also recognize that engaging in respectful conversation is just one mode of bringing one's case to one's fellows. Protest and organizing are also legitimate modes of engagement, although subject to time and place restrictions. For anyone who feels motivated to protest the class or particular speakers or to make a long speech, please go outside. There's a free speech zone that's provided where you can do so. Before I introduce today's topics and speakers, if you are a student enrolled in the course, could you scan the QR code on the screen and fill out the Google form for attendance? That should be up, and hopefully the link is working. Okay, so as mentioned, our topic today is, does meritocracy make America better, some might say fairer, and more prosperous? We're very fortunate to have two knowledgeable and thoughtful participants to discuss this. Daniel Markovits is the Guido Calabrese Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Life. He publishes widely and in a range of disciplines, including law, philosophy, and economics. He holds a BA in math from Yale, an MSc in econometrics and mathematical economics from the LSE, a BPhil, DPhil in philosophy from the University of Oxford, and a JD from Yale Law School. His most recent book is The Meritocracy Trap, where he develops a sustained attack on American meritocracy, placing meritocracy at the center of rising inequality and social and political dysfunction. Our second guest, Richard Epstein, has spent much of his academic life at the University of Chicago Law School, currently is a professor at NYU School of Law and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Service Professor of Law Emeritus and a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago. He holds a BA from Columbia, he studied law at Oxford, and he completed his legal studies at Yale. He served as the editor of the Journal of Legal Studies and the Journal of Law and Economics. He's a prolific writer whose most recent books include The Dubious Morality of the Modern Administrative State. So today's discussion gets at the heart of what kind of society do we want? A meritocratic society, a just society? Can these overlap? Are they the same? A more solidarity society? Each of our speakers will talk initially for about 10 minutes and then converse until around 4:15 our time. The floor will then be open for questions and comments from the audience. To allow as much participation as possible, keep your comments to about a minute. And we're now going to survey the audience, as we do at the beginning of each class, and then we want to see whether arguments move minds. That said, even when arguments do not move minds, we hope the class gives you appreciation for the reasoning behind views you hold, as well as behind views you reject. So the question that we're posing, and can that go up on the stage, is, does meritocracy make America better and more prosperous? So I don't yet see the question. I see a blank space. So please fill out the poll.
So for those who can't see, that's 75% or so saying yes, and about 25% or so saying no.
And now, let's welcome our two guests, if we can see them again on the screen. Hello, Daniel. Hello, Richard. Thank you for being with us. And Daniel, why don't you begin?
Great. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, I've been told I can share my screen, which I believe I have done. If someone could just indicate that you can see the title page now of some slides. Excellent. Great. So thanks again. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to be on with you both. Nice to be in conversation with you, Richard. And I look forward to the next hour and a half or so. I'm going to start just by saying something very brief just to set up what it is that we're talking about. Meritocracy allocates advantage based on accomplishment rather than on some other factor: race, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, and so on. Now, of course, to make meritocracy functional, a society has to decide what counts as accomplishment. In the old Chinese meritocracy, for example, accomplishment was constituted by classical learning of a certain philosophical and philological sort. Our meritocracy adopts a market measure. Accomplishment is connected to the size of someone's human capital. And human capital is built in competitive meritocratic schools, measured by test scores and grades, and then priced in a competitive labor market, measured by a person's wage. Now, meritocracy, so understood, has two core virtues, and both of these were understood in the United States when meritocracy was made real in the US in the 1950s and 60s, both by those who were trying to make a meritocratic revolution and by those who were trying to resist it. First, meritocracy gives everybody a fair shot at getting ahead, so the story goes. And those who wanted to make meritocracy at Yale to be parochial Inky Clark and Kingman Brewster understood that this was a way of opening up a closed and sclerotic elite. And those who wanted to stop meritocracy, William F. Buckley Jr. and some people in the Yale Corporation, also understood that this is one of the things that meritocracy did. And I think most of us will think that it's a virtue if a system creates a structure in which everyone has a fair shot of getting ahead. Second, meritocracy produces a capable elite. Again, at Yale, Kingman Brewster was very worried that the old elite was dull, boring, ineffectual. He thought of himself, he said, as an intellectual investment banker, trying to invest educational resources in those who would develop the most human capital and talent out of them. And this was, again, understood by people on both sides of the debate. And very quickly, elite American universities transformed from places where effectively dull, lazy, but well-born people spent their youth to places where hardworking and industrious people strove to get ahead. Now, I have set this up in a way to identify what I take to be meritocracy's two strong intuitive virtues. It's fair, and it promotes a capable and functional elite. And what I now want to do is spend the rest of my time explaining why I think that while in the early days of meritocracy, it in fact achieved these virtues, today meritocracy sets them both back. And that will happen in several movements. First, I want to talk a little bit about how our meritocracy actually functions, and then I want to evaluate it. So first of all, who gets ahead? Well, one of the reasons why the old elite was so incapable is that, to be blunt, aristocrats were not very hardworking and they weren't very smart. And that meant that they did not devote a lot of energy to training their children. And in 1960, 1965, for example, the most competitive schools in the United States, high schools in the United States, were all public schools. Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, those sorts of places. The private schools were finishing schools for the dull and lazy but wealthy. The meritocratic elite, though, that won the first round of that meritocratic competition in the 60s and 70s were unlike those whom they supplanted in that they had an unmatched capacity for training their children and an unlimited appetite for doing so. And so today in the United States, rich parents out-educate everybody else. If you look at the gap, for example, between what's spent on a typical middle-class kid in high school, about $12,000 to $15,000 a year, and what's spent on a typical poor kid in the United States, about $8,000, that's a $4,000 gap. But a typical super rich kid, top 1 or 2% of the income distribution, who attends an elite private school, gets maybe $75,000 per year spent on their education. Notice the rich middle class gap, $60,000, is 15 times as big as the gap between what's spent on the middle class kid and what's spent on the poor kid. And this produces dramatic differences in childhood achievement. Over the past 50 or 70 years, the rich have left the middle class behind in their children's academic achievement, even as the middle class and the poor have converged, and the rich-poor differences have become enormous. By 2000, the 90-10 percentile income gap, so the gap between the academic achievement of kids whose parents are in the top 10% of the income distribution and kids whose parents are in the bottom 10% of the income distribution, had reached a state, that's in the red line here, which is higher than what the white-black gap was in 1954.
Daniel, can I interrupt you for a second because the slides are not showing? We've only really seen the title slide at this point.
So I don't know what to say because my slides are showing. It says I'm sharing my screen. I don't understand why not.
And it's showing on your screen.
On my screen, the slides are advancing. I will try again. Hold on. There was an audio problem actually at your end earlier on. Do you see them now?
Now we're seeing the.
And do you see things moving?
Yes.
Okay, I'll pick up from here. So by 2000, the rich-poor gap had become larger. This is the red line. Then the white-black gap was in 1954. So economic inequality in the United States today is producing greater differences in childhood academic achievement than apartheid did before Brown v. Board of Education was decided. Once again, the biggest gaps in achievement are between the rich and the middle class, not between the middle class and the poor. The gap between the average SAT score of a kid whose parents are in the top 5% of the income distribution and a kid whose parents are right at the median is about 250 points. But the gap between the median kid and a kid whose parents are at or below the poverty level is only about 125 points. So the rich middle class gap is twice the middle class poor gap. These investments produce a highly skewed elite. This is the odds of going to college in America as a function of your parents' income rank. And the only thing that's more unequal than that is this, which is the quality of the college that you attend as a function of your parents' income rank. At the 150 or so most competitive colleges in America, kids from the top quarter of the distribution are overrepresented compared to the bottom quarter by a factor of 14 to 1, and compared to each of the middle two quarters by a factor of 6 to 1. And the skew gets only bigger as colleges get more elite. In the Ivy Plus colleges in recent years, there have been more kids whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution than the entire bottom half. And at Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale, there have been more kids whose parents are in the top 1% than the bottom 60%. Now, one way to think about this is to compare what this involves to the old-fashioned inheritance that aristocrats used to pass their privilege down through their families' generations. Aristocrats just died and left their children bequests of estates, land, or factories. What the meritocrats do is, instead of giving benefits or assets to their children when they die, they give these in the form of educational investments while they are still alive. And if you were to take the difference between the resources devoted to a typical 1% household's kid in their education and what was given to a typical middle-class kid, not a poor kid, and to construct the equivalent of an inheritance, each year put that in the S&P 500 to be given as a traditional bequest to the child on the death of the parents, this would amount to more than $10 million per child. So elite education has become a technology through which elite families pass their dynastic privilege down through their generations. Why is it so important to get these educations? Well, to be blunt, it's because the graduates of the top universities today dominate the top jobs. Rising economic inequality in the United States is not actually caused predominantly by a shift of income away from labor and towards capital, but rather by a shift of income among workers, away from middle-class workers and in favor of super skilled elite workers. If you want to know who the 1% are in America, it's these people here. And if you look at who they are, all of them require elite degrees to get their jobs. Today, the top 1% of the distribution owes about 3/4 of its income to its labor, compared to only about 1/3 in the middle of the last century. And the reason why, or the mechanism by which elite workers are getting so highly paid, is that the skew between the wages paid to elite workers in a particular sector of the economy and the wages paid to those with less elite educations who work side by side with them has become increasingly extreme. So in all of these areas, it used to be that the elite worker made materially more than the less elite worker. And today, the elite worker makes tens, hundreds, or even thousands of times more than the less elite worker. The reason behind this is that the economy has shifted around so that middle-class jobs, the routine jobs in the middle of this slide, have disappeared, even as elite jobs have exploded. And what this has done is it has taken labor hours as well as hourly wages away from the bottom part of the income distribution. So the bottom 60% of the US income distribution today works about 10 hours less a week than it did in 1940. And that's not because people in that part of the distribution don't want to work, it's because the economy is not providing them with jobs. So how do those two developments in school and at work interact with meritocracy's claims to moral virtue? Remember, the idea was that meritocracy gives everybody a fair shot at success, and that meritocracy makes an elite that capably produces shared prosperity. Well, with respect to the first, it turns out that elites today are overwhelmingly the graduates of a very small number of schools. Partners at the 5 most profitable law firms overwhelmingly graduate from only about 10 law schools. At the single most profitable law firm, 4/5 of the partners graduate from 1 of 5 law schools. Overall, education segments earnings in America to an astonishing degree. Only about 7% of workers with a high school degree will earn more over their lifetime than the median college graduate, and only about 1% of high school only workers, and only about 17% of workers with a BA only will earn more than the median professional school graduate. Now, remember that the parents who earn the high salaries on account of their high incomes then invest those salaries in training their children in the same schools that they themselves attended, and the cycle continues again and again and again, so that meritocracy, which was initially embraced to promote equality of opportunity, has today become the single greatest obstacle to equality of opportunity in the country. Now, if we talk about prosperity, it turns out that this elite has not done a very good job of growing the economy. If you look at increased economic productivity over the past 70 years, the 2 decades before meritocracy took over America, the 50s and 60s, had higher total factor productivity growth on average than the 3 decades after meritocracy took over the economy. And if you ask at the level of individual households, what are the odds of earning more than your parents over your lifetime? Those who were born in a pre-meritocratic America in 1940 were overwhelmingly likely to earn more than their parents. And those who were born in a post-meritocratic America in 1980 were overwhelmingly less likely to earn more than their parents. And the drop-off in the odds of earning more than your parents was greatest for the broad middle class. So let me close by thinking about how we can characterize these phenomena. There is the familiar economic puzzle, which is why are societies that are rich in natural resources, oil, gold, diamonds, other minerals, often poor and unstable? Think about the Democratic Republic of Congo, GDP per capita, $500 roughly. While societies that have few natural resources or even no natural resources are rich and stable. Singapore is the only country in the world to have won its independence by expulsion from Malaysia. No natural resources, a GDP per capita of $60,000. There are lots of reasons: colonialism, exploitation, extraction, but that's not the whole story. Notice Singapore was colonized also, but one reason economists have used to explain this is what they call the resource curse. Resource-rich countries focus on extractive industries, drilling, mining, so on, and extraction does some things to a society. It concentrates wealth in landowners, it requires a large class of oppressed workers, and it discourages broad investments in education and the development of an independent and flourishing middle class. This undermines democracy, it encourages corruption, and it produces slow growth and political instability. Now, the United States, if my characterizations in the first part of this short presentation are correct, has invented a new version of the resource curse. The cursed resource for us isn't oil or gold or diamonds. It's human capital. It's the skill and training of free workers. The labor market concentrates work, income, and status in a narrow class of super-educated, superordinate workers. These are the people with elite college degrees or elite professional degrees who dominate the top 1% of the income distribution. They then dominate an underemployed and stagnating middle class whose wages have stagnated, whose work hours have fallen. The elite then uses its incomes to capture human capital for the next generation of its own families by buying schooling that no one else can afford. And its children monopolize the universities and top jobs in the next generation. The cycle continues: social and economic stratification, undemocratic politics, corruption, low growth, all inexorably follow. And that's what we're seeing in the United States today. So meritocratic inequality casts a human resource curse. Now that leaves us with a dark prognosis. I'm going to end on a darker note, but I'll have a brief window of hope, and perhaps we can talk about that in the conversation. If you look at all of human experience across all of time and space, there's only one society that has managed to unwind as extreme a concentration of income and wealth in as narrow an elite as the United States suffers today, without succumbing to a domestic revolution or to defeat against a foreign enemy. The glimmer of hope is that that society was the United States in 1929. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And now over to Richard.
Yeah, I'm going to be less dogmatic and less slide, but let me ask the following kinds of questions. The first of all, when you start looking at the rich people, And what they have done, the one thing you'd want to ask about them is, have they done anything that you would regard as improper when they spend an enormous amount of time trying to educate their own children, as I certainly did with mine. That meant not only paying for elite schools, but a huge amount of the education that we provided to our children came from helping them with their violin lessons, reading them stories at night, and doing a whole variety of activities with them, which were not wealth dependent, but dependent upon our general senses. So the question then is, you don't want to stop these kinds of behaviors. So what kinds of reforms do you want to make, which in turn is going to depend on what it is you think was the source of the gaps that took place in question. And at this particular point, Daniel has not offered us any particular explanation as to how this thing turned around. It certainly cannot be in a democratic society because of the machinations of the top 1 or 2% of the population. In fact, one number that one has to note in this regard is we are looking at the system of taxation in the United States, taking all taxes in at all time. The United States, in fact, has an extremely progressive tax system. And not only is a large amount of the wealth concentrated in the top percent, but there's a greater percentage of the wealth that is taxed, which is in that same group. These individuals turn out to be political losers when it comes to the question of whether or not they can keep their income. So if they've lost out in that particular way and they still continue to succeed, why is it that the rest of the problem is much more difficult? Well, I'm going to give a very different explanation. And the explanation that I have is that it's the change in the structural constitution of the United States between the periods when this started and the current situation. I should make it very clear at the outset that something which Daniel never mentioned is something which has obsessed me since I started teaching law back in 1968, which was the power of labor unions of one form or another to restrict output and to demand special treatments for themselves. So if you start looking at the way education was, when I went to elementary school in 1948, it was an extraordinary environment. It was basically union-free. There were huge numbers of teachers, at least in New York, who came in from very fortunate circumstances or unfortunate circumstances. They tended to be Jewish parents in the 1930s who could not, or teachers in the 30s, who could not get jobs in industry because of the Depression. And I was benefited by an extraordinary education that many of them provided. Now, the moment unionization started to take place, it turns out that it created a very different kind of environment. For the one thing, when it started to take place with respect to schools, the single most dramatic feature was the way in which union prerogatives started to dominate over educational objectives. And if you want just one very recent example of how this works, the situation in Chicago is one in great extremities, and the mayor in the city is now faced with demands which he likely wants to back to increase teacher salaries by 9%, to reduce their obligations, and to get rid of all forms of testing with respect to teachers and with respect to unions. All of this, by the way, has very powerful ramifications when you start moving out of the particular system, because the same forces that are trying to get strong wages within this system are the same sources that want to make sure that testing does not take place, lest their failure be disclosed. That takes very strong efforts to try to resist vouchers on the one hand, homeschooling, religious education, and so forth. And what has happened is, during the same period that we have seen the increase of wealth upon the rich, we have also seen a devastating level of restrictions on the way in which standard education is going to form. This country has gotten richer. But when I took the SACs back in 1960, the median was essentially 500. That curve continued to disintegrate, going through larger periods, even at a time when the amount of money per capita spent on children, particularly in large school systems, started to increase very dramatically. So they had to recenter the test. And so what used to be a 437 now became a 500. And the whole scale had to change. And why was that? It had nothing to do with the wealth of rich parents who had to send their kids either to public schools, as I went in New York City, or in private schools. What it had to do was a complete breakdown in the way in which the educational requirements inside the United States have happened. So that's one source that we have to worry about. More recently, we have other difficulties, it seems to me, that really matter, which is we cease to understand what it is that an education is supposed to solve. We're supposed to try to create and advance human knowledge. That's our job in a university. When you're talking about students in elementary school and students in high school, it's a somewhat different charge. What they're supposed to do is to be able to transform the tradition or transmit the tradition of education that we have to young people, And there's only one way in which you can do that, and that is the stress fundamentals that are important to all kids, regardless of their race, color, creed, or national origin. And that means you have to learn numbers. It means that you have to learn how to parse a sentence. It means that you have to learn history. It means that you have to have a working knowledge with respect to all the sciences. And then if you start moving a little bit further from that, you try to get students, as they go into advanced courses, to have greater sophistication in what they can do. This is something which is, in fact, kept at some of the major private schools that we've seen. But at many of them, I think they've deteriorated. But the public school system has gotten very much worse. So rather than talking about global problems, which may or may not have anything to do with all of this, I think it's a clear point that what we have to do is to recognize that the education system that we have has completely failed. If it turns out that you spend more money now on the education of poor children than you've ever spent before, and have managed to get less output with the amount of money that you spent, only, I think, because in large part of this basically regulatory vice that has been put over the particular system. And I don't hear Daniel giving any other explanation that will work, because it turns out that wealth is a political target as well as a political asset. And you start seeing the transfers of wealth, they tend to go more towards poorer classes than to richer classes. If you look at this and try to figure out what income is, you can't just look at earnings. Phil Graham has done a lot of studies on this. And what they show quite convincingly is if you start to take into account the transfer economy as well as the earning economy, the decline in income is much less, or the growth in income differentials are much smaller than was stated by Daniel, who only is looking at earned income rather than at transfer payments. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? I am very uneasy about the whole system of transfer payments, because I think that what we really want to do is to promote some kind of a sense of excellence on the part of our student body. I also think that it's a terrible mistake in making this kind of analysis to spend yourself talking mainly about the elite classes. The United States consists of large numbers of people whose IQs are not in the 1% at the top, say 130, whatever number you want. We have to find a decent society that can provide jobs for people with differential levels of intelligence. A model which posits that we want to send everybody to college is a disastrous model under these circumstances. What we have to do is to be candid about different aptitudes and different skills. And in the olden days, we used to have vocational schools that were involved for young men and for young women, which would allow them to transition into a working economy without having to go to college. Right now, it's kind of uneasy to say that the number of students who are abandoning a college education because they regard it as largely irrelevant to their own academic success and their own meritorious success is a very serious thing. Because again, even at the college level, there is a real decline in teaching the kind of fundamental skills that you need in order to succeed. So what happens is the great strength of America still is its decentralized economy. We don't have either Daniel or myself or even your two worthy professors who dictate what counts as merit. What you do is you have large numbers of employers and large numbers of vocational schools that start to do this. And my son, who's an educator, investing in these countries one time or another, he just looks at me as an Ivy League product and he says, the problem with you is you know how to educate the top 1%. My job is to figure out how to educate virtually everybody else, and traditional schools don't work. And so the solution that we have in many cases doesn't depend upon the way in which we refine the academic curriculum that we give at elite institutions. It depends upon how it is that we manage to make educated people who are perfectly able to work at trades. So if you start looking at the system at that point, it turns out in many ways it's much more effective as a private side than it is because of all the government stuff. And so, if people can go in and take a course when they're earning, say, $35,000 a year and pay it back over 5 years so they could earn twice that money, it's a huge achievement that we have to have, and it's one that we ought to encourage. So just to finish up on this stuff, I think there are many things that are wrong with privilege. I think Daniel was just dead wrong to say that everybody was in that older aristocracy was somehow the decrepit and so forth. That's the kind of generalization that I very much despise. I think it's too dangerous. I think there were certainly people like that. But when I was in college, one of the things that struck me as being almost the saddest thing imaginable is there were many students that we had who came in on scholarships and blew the opportunity they had by getting drunk on a Friday night and not sobering up on a Monday morning. So a lot of it depends upon character. And I think what one has to do is we have to instill not only academic skills in our young people, but we have to instill in them a sense that their hard labor and their cooperation with other individuals will start to matter. And in this regard, one of the things that, of course, manages the currency, which I think is a general downer, is that we tend to play much more divisive games, and we start to talk about the reasons to doing programs like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I am firmly opposed to. It seems to me that what you want to do is to move merit. You want to try to get kids in there. You could get higher productivity. And then what do you also hope to get with ill productivity? The United States, for a very long period of time, relied on systems of voluntary redistribution from people who had money to people who did not. And if you start looking at the foundation of the great universities, including Stanford, right? It was founded by a guy whose son happened to die. It was called the Farm, and he gave a huge amount of money, and he was very clear about the way in which he wanted it to be spent. And I'm a Hoover Fellow, and Herbert Hoover was one of the great philanthropists of the first third of the 20th century, and he had exactly the same kinds of aspirations. So what we try to do when people is not to have government programs that are always going to be ham-handed and administered by people whom you have no faith in. What you try to do in order to ease the inequality problem is to have various kinds of programs of private transformations, such as scholarships and other kinds of awards. Why do you want to do that? It turns out if you have a donor who's giving the money, they'll care what it is that the person's going to do. So I'll end on this simple example. My father went to City College in the 1920s. It was by far the greatest college in the United States at that time, far better than Harvard or Yale or any other place. And it turned out it was free. But why did it work when it was free? It worked because there were rigorous entry tests in order to get in there, and the clear sense that if you did not make the best of this opportunity, when you get out, there was no support mechanisms for you. And what happens if you propose a general education today in which there's no kind of check like that, it's just a vast waste of money because the incentive structure is completely different. So rather than worrying about these grand charts and these cosmic movements, it seems to me that what you have to worry about is the micro motives and the various structures that are much closer to education in an effort to try to get rid of a situation where we both agree that the prognosis in the recent year, or the diagnosis of the recent year, has been very, very bad, but we strongly disagree on what ought to be the cure for that kind of relationship. So I'll stop.
So thank you. So we have two radically different descriptions of the phenomenon and of the causes. Back to you, Daniel.
Well, how long would you like me to speak?
Not
You know,
too long.
We basically have the next.
I think maybe I should break it up, because I think there are some points, Richard, on which we actually agree, and I'd like to get to those. I'm much fonder of government than you are, but I don't think that government regulation is the central answer to the problem we've got here for a variety of reasons. But maybe it makes sense for us to start by thinking a little bit about points at which we disagree. One point at which I think we disagree, and we're not going to be able to resolve that here, because what we would need to do is look at data and evidence, which is hard to bring up in a conversation. I don't think it's actually the case that the absolute level of educational accomplishment outside the elite has gone down over the past 50 years. The best evidence that we have, both from US educational survey data and broadly from the PISA data and also tests of adult skills, is that students are more literate, more numerate, better at managing data today than they were 50 years ago, and that adults have more traditional education-backed skills than they used to have. Particularly, that's true also in the bottom of the skill and training distribution. But what's really striking over the past 50 years is that the explosion of elaborate and extreme training in the elite has opened up a gap between the rich and the rest in their human capital, in their skill and training, without a diminution in the skill and training outside of the elite. So that's a factual question that, as I say, we can assert each what we think, but we can't actually resolve it in this conversation because we'd have to go look at the data. Now, one other thing that I think is worth just identifying early on is another part of the diagnosis that I have about which we might disagree is part of the story I want to tell is that the extreme training of the elite has induced technological innovations which change the way in which we make goods and deliver services to favor precisely the peculiar skills that the elite has now got. Let me give one example, and then I'll stop, and maybe Richard, you should react. Think about finance. In the late 1950s, The Economist writes a cover story asking whether finance, banking, is the world's most respectable declining industry. People working in finance were neither better educated nor more highly paid than the rest of the non-farm private sector workforce. Today, finance is one of the most educated, most highly paid sectors of the economy. One of the reasons for that is that the financial technology of production has changed. Let me give an example. Think about home mortgage lending. It used to be that the dominant production worker in the home mortgage market was the loan officer. This was a middle-class, mid-skilled person whose job it was to assess individual borrowers and individual houses to determine whether loans were providently made by banks that would originate the mortgage and then hold it through the mortgage's life. Today, loan officers are totally de-skilled. They're paid much, much less well. The accuracy of their initial loan determinations is not so important because all of their loans are securitized and sold on and packaged into portfolios to hedge out loan-specific risk. That has happened because a group of super skilled workers, initially trained in physics, remade the technology of financial lending so that it became more efficient for banks to use super skilled workers to manage the lending. And so this is an instance in which what's happened is the concentration of training in a meritocratic elite in universities has caused new innovations which change the technology of financial production to favor precisely their skills and exclude middle-class workers from meaningful jobs. And that's an example of something that's happened throughout the economy. And that's what I think is driving the inequality that we have right now. And that's a different account from the unionization and de-skilling story that you're telling.
Well, the unionization problem is very serious, but it's also met by the fact that it's a declining fraction of the workforce. And the reason it declines is that in the private sector, it cannot compete with firms that are much more nimble in the way they hand it. The reason it succeeds in the public sector is free entry is not possible because you have local school monopolies. But I could tell the same story in the 1950s. I still remember watching Judy Holliday movies where the joke was that she had this switchboard and she was constantly putting these wires one place into another. And then what happened is the fine people at Bell Labs decided to figure out how to automate this system. And so that instead of having this done by a technology which would require 100 million people to operate, you have exactly the same situation that you did in the other industries, is that as it becomes more automated, you can see it grow. First you get area codes, then it turns out you just get 10-digit numbers, then you get the connection. And nobody today knows what it is to make, when I ask anybody under 30, did you make a person-to-person call or did you make a station-to-station call? They don't even know what you're talking about, because there's no difference today in any way, shape, or form in the domestic markets, at least, between what is a long-distance call and a local call. And this is a good thing. So what happens to all the people who are displaced from these kind of jobs? Well, it's not that they go looking for other total jobs, is that they start looking out to find positions in other kinds of industries. And so the most important thing to start to do is to see where people who now have got human capital go. And well, I'll give you one illustration. It turns out that the economy is getting older now. I'm a person in my 80s and I'm still functioning, but there are many people who are my age, Paul's age and so forth, who are not. And so if you start looking at the expansion in the healthcare sector, it turns out that you get very many more people in that sector today than you had before. So if you try to basically just simply say, oh, where do these poor workers go, and just look at other finance industries, the answer is they don't go within the finance industry. Their training and all of their development takes place in other skills. And so what you have to do is to go start looking at the kind of situations there. even, for example, within a trade. So there was a time once when in the journalism industry, before we had all of the online services, journalists were kind of doyens of the society. They wrote columns. There were relatively few of them. Now it turns out people say, oh my God, the print industry is dying. There are many fewer local papers. But the number of people in journalism who work in online businesses at respectable salary is probably tenfold of the number of people who are in this industry when we had it. And so I think it's just the wrong way to think about any of these issues, to assume that automation or improvement in one sector only leads to displacement of jobs. What it does is it creates opportunities in other sectors, because the low cost of the inputs that you have here allow people to go. And one thing is, by the way, that you mentioned, which is just wrong, is securitization is not the answer to all your problems. It's a very important technique, but if you securitize as you did in 2005 and 2006, you manage to basically socialize and get and diversify various kinds of locational risks, but you did not able to diversify the interest rate risk, which was universal across all these portfolios. And people simply did not govern themselves for that. So the explanation in that is that all these technical whiz guys made all sorts of mistakes because they didn't take into account the nature of the correlated losses that were not solved by the form of diversification that they have. And this is also a feature. Anytime you start with a new technology, it can work out very, very well, but if it has a bug in it, the bug is going to spread much more rapidly in a digitized economy than it is in a localized economy, so that for every advantage, you're going to have a little disadvantage. And the optimal question then is, how much of this stuff do you want to do? And it also, in this area, I think it's pretty clear on the regulatory side that the folks, including many people like Lawrence Summers, who thought that the counterparty protection was sufficient to prevent financial meltdown, were wrong. And it turns out that it's an industry which I teach in, and you need to have certain kinds of minimum capital accounts to prevent this thing from absolutely going out of a whack. So the point here is not that you're in favor of deregulation across the board. It's that you're in favor of deregulation that stops the sensible movement of labor and capital, which is what has happened in education. But you need regulation in the banking industries because the risk of runs, the mismatch of maturities, and so forth create a series of problems, which, if anything, are more urgent today than they were 50 or 100 years ago.
Deborah has a comment.
So I have a question. I want to push on the meritocracy piece, since both of you, although you have different views, accept the idea that meritocracy rewards kind of achievement, produced achievement. And then the question, is that fair given the unequal assets that might flow into the production of that achievement? So that's one view of meritocracy, but another view of meritocracy is that meritocracy is about identifying potential, and that's very different. And so the poor kid whose family never got to invest in their success, are there ways a meritocratic system looks at how to count that class and kid and recognize what Roger Chetty calls the missing Einsteins, the kids who have the potential to succeed at the very highest parts of the economy, and why define meritocracy as already building in all the inequality as opposed to define it in terms of recognizing potential?
Well, you're right. I mean, look, my son for many years worked at the then Harlem Success Schools and now just the Success Academies. And what happens is that these are schools which are designed to take kids from very low income background and to give an environment in which they're able to perform. And it does so first by demanding that they have high levels of performance in a no excuse economy, and that their parents take active roles in making sure what goes on. And so if you remember, there was one of these movies about the kids waiting, can't remember its name, to see whether or not they would win the lottery in New York City to get into one of these elite programs. And as you watched, the parents who got in were elated. The parents who didn't get in, they were almost in tears. And why was that? Because going into a Success Academy of school instead of a city public school was probably worth, in terms of your lifetime's income, $1 million or more. And so that's the situation. What you want to do is to expand these kinds of opportunities. and let these parties start to do those kinds of things. And my son would tell me stories that would break your heart. He said the 8-year-old kid was in the Success Academy schools and his 10-year-old brother was not. And so the 8-year-old was teaching the 10-year-old the math that he did not learn in that public school system. So, I mean, there's nothing more important as far as I'm concerned than identifying talent in young people. And I think we ought to commit an enormous amount of resources to do so as a society. Jim Heckman, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, Deborah, right? What does he tell you? He says, if you want to get these kids, either give them huge amounts of stuff very early on, or the subsequent stuff just does not matter. And so you have to have to try to educate kids before they're 6 or 7, even in many ways before 2 or 3 years old. And I agree with all of that stuff, but the current system fails because what it does is it chokes off the organizations that are able to make that happen.
Although Daniel's also pointing out that the amount of just sheer money that the very wealthy are able to invest in their children, which is a worthy thing for them to do, but it just overpowers what.
No, it does not. A
Can I
public
make
school kid
points
is.
about that? Richard, you finish and then let me jump in.
Okay, I just want to say one sentence. We spend far more per kid in a public school system than we do in a charter school system, and the performance is far better in the latter. And these differences really matter. We spend $25,000 in New York City on a public school kid. That's close to a private school tuition, but it's spent in a totally inappropriate environment.
So a couple of things, and we can talk about whether public school spending for those who are outside of the elite is well structured or effective. But I think that's not actually the center of our debate. I think that there are 2 points that are raised, Deborah, by your observation. One is, look, of course, it is a very good thing for a society to create pathways for people whose parents are not privileged to get some of the educational benefits that privileged kids get. The question is whether that mechanism of restoring something like equality of opportunity is one that is plausibly scaled to the size of the problem that we have. And my view is that the answer is no, and that universities like yours, like mine, prayerfully hope that the answer could be yes, because that's a way in which these universities can retain their eliteness, but also become mechanisms of opportunity for the broader population. And I'm afraid that, in fact, the scale of the eliteness and the size of the inequality of outcomes is so big that it cannot be rendered consistent with equality of opportunity. One way to think about that, as you observed a moment ago in response to Richard, the extent of the rich parents' investment in their kids is so great that society can't afford to universalize that. So one question is, yes, it's a great thing to identify people from the outside and create pathways for them to come into elites, but will that really produce fairness, or will it just launder elite privilege with a little bit of leavening of outsiders to make it seem okay? I'm inclined to think it's the second, not the first.
Well, every kid who goes to the
let me
system.
just one more quick point on this. The second question concerns what counts as accomplishment. And one of the things that happens when you have an enormous amount of inequality is that people, adults, focus their working energies on goods and services that are themselves artifacts of inequality. Various forms of the provision of luxury goods, various forms of finance which depend on antecedent inequality to become a going concern. And those are types of goods and services that have very high wages because they have very high private returns for those who deliver them, but they aren't actually particularly good for society. And so another thing that's happening in the system that we have is that we're distorting what adults think is worthwhile doing, because the market pays certain kinds of people much, much more than it pays other kinds of people. One concrete example of this, and then Richard, over to you. There was a study done by some economists in England a few years back, which reports that the wage paid to a lawyer or a banker per hour is almost equal to that lawyer's or banker's contribution to GDP. but the wage paid to a nurse or home health aide per hour is about 1/10 of that worker's contribution to GDP. And those distortions are themselves connected to the forms of educational inequality that we have, and they misdirect people's attention in ways that are bad for society overall.
Look, I mean, one of the things you've argued for is an increase in the wages of nurses, which is fine by me if you could find a way to afford it. The difficulty that you have is that social value is very, very high, but the ability to pay for the services from people of limited income is very, very low. And so you're going to have to then have huge subsidies to try to cover this up, which is then going to sort of affect in an adverse fashion the productivity that takes place with respect to other kinds of activities. So I don't think there's any kind of easy way out of it, because one of the things that you're saying, which I think is quite correct, but very troublesome, is that wages are not necessarily a matter of social contribution. They're a matter of private gain, but the external effects can be very positive. But
Can we
also,
just pause on that for 1 second? Can I just ask you just a question about that example?
Yeah.
So I get the way you're framing this, and I think there's a lot in it. But here's another problem, which I think is more aligned with the broader way I want to look at the problem than with the broader way you do, but I wonder how you think about it, which is, so we have to provide medical care to people, right? Which is, we have to convert effort by people who are trained in medicine into good population health. And we can do this in a variety of ways. One way in which we can do it is one that invests heavily in specialist medical techniques and specialist medical doctors. Another way we can do it is one that invests heavily in much lower skilled generalist nurse practitioners and others, and basically provide people with healthcare using more less skilled workers to intervene at different points in the wellness and illness cycle. And if we did that, if we had more nurses, more dietitians, more exercise therapists, and fewer specialist doctors, including by precluding rich people from buying as many specialist doctors as they want, we would have better population health and the labor market.
Well, let me just, I mean, this is an area I work in fairly full time. And one of the things that's so striking about the numbers is that the amount of money spent in ICUs for people who are within 10 days of death is an extraordinary amount relative to the amount that's spent on basic education. But the problem about the system is that it has, under the Medicare program, which is put into place, these are not private dollars that are being spent. These are public dollars that are being spent. And they're being spent in that way because of the extraordinary influence of a lobby on the older side of the situation that makes sure that all of these kinds of programs start to move in its direction. And so the way in which you have to stop this thing is to get the subsidies out of these kinds of programs. So if you go back to 1965 and the program is being put into place, everybody says we have green eye shades and we're going to make sure that the participants in these programs pay at least 50% of the total cost, and maybe some of the others will be picked up, mainly for the services you were talking about, services for taking care of people who have serious illnesses that need relatively simple cure. Well, these ratios are completely out of control. There's been no effort whatsoever on the part of anybody to shut it down. This is a classic illustration how in-groups get to spend their money. Then you try to get it out.
Do you think that a democracy can ration emergency care for the poor if it allows the rich to buy as much as they can afford?
Well, I regard this as a total horror. I don't, look, I can tell you, having run these things, that, you know, you put a program like EMTALA into place, and I had to work with this at the University of Chicago. What we tried to do was to get a sensible system that would allow you to spend the burden of taking these very expensive courses, of course, multiple houses in the system. And the city of Chicago said, no, you cannot do this. You must bring them to the closest hospital, even if it turns out they already have 3 crews working on a Saturday night and another place is completely empty. And we tried heaven and earth to allow them to give us a diversion program, which they would not do. And you know what we did? We were suffering such heavy losses that the University of Chicago shut down a large portion of its emergency care system because it could not pay for the overlay. And it wasn't as though we needed more money. What we needed was more sense. I mean, look, I spend most of my time working with markets that fail. That's my academic career. It's not working with markets that succeed. Those are boring, right? It's the failed one. And it turns out that almost and always the sort of the public choice element of this is one of the most destructive things that we start to have. And so when it starts to come to try to figure out what it is that you want to do, you have to change it. You know, look, I can give you another thing. Let me just give you an example of how simple it can be. It saves the lives of God knows how many people a year, hundreds of thousands. It was discovered by these guys, Banting and Best. They were two crazy kind of guys, and they forgot their own formula. Do you know how long it took to get this thing commercialized after they got it through in an age before the FDA? 1 year. And do you know how long it took for them to get this so that Eli Lilly could give it out for free for people who could not afford it? They had full equilibrium in this market by 1930. You at a market of today, do you know what the front end cost is of getting this thing through all the approvals? It's basically the best estimates of between 1.4 and $2 billion for a major new therapeutic innovation. What you have to do is to figure out how you break that logjam. And it turns out that we do not know how to do this, because what we're always doing is we're always protecting people. And then, just to add to it, it turns out making biologics is a completely different business. So it is with respect to vaccine. And what do we do through this system is we manage to rush this stuff through in such an irresponsible way that if you actually follow the numbers and all the complexities, it turns out we kill more people than we save with the vaccines, in my judgment. And I've looked at this pretty closely. You could ask Jay Bhattacharya on your own Stanford faculty to see it. So we are messing everything up. I'm not interested in trying to do this by wealth transfers. I'm interested in trying to do it by getting rid of the labyrinth which creates all of these particular problems. And it's just sickening to see the way in which these things work. Look, I'm a Brooklyn boy, right? You know what that means? I'm a small d Democrat, right? This is everything that you're seeing here is the worst form of intergroup politics. And it simply defies parties.
Let's Deborah and Paul, do you want to focus us back on one part of the meritocracy question?
Yes.
That's okay, but the regulatory barriers matter.
So let me ask a question.
We won't disagree about that.
Before we throw this open to our students, I have two questions. And the first one is we really have two different theories of causation. And one has to do with the transfer of wealth via getting kids very well prepared to go to elite institutions. The other has to do with government screwing up markets. How can any of us mediate between those two? They could coexist. One could be much stronger than the other. How can we, as listeners to this, figure that out?
Richard, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll try this. Look, I mean, one of the things that I've always believed, and I was going to start my talk with this, is the dominant view that we have today towards market imperfections is first to basically regulate and then to subsidize those people who are regulated. So take something like a minimum wage law, and you have this going on right now in California, where they raised it to the point where many, many people are losing jobs. And then somebody says, well, we can't get rid of this, it's so important. Then they try to tax other individuals in order to make a wage supplement for the people who would otherwise be displaced. You have to break that cycle. And how is it being broken? Well, California is a 6th state. And how do you measure that? A very simple measurement is number of people coming in and number of people leaving and who they are. And it turns out the movement of intelligent, high, ambitious people from shall we say, Palo Alto to Austin is getting larger every day because what happens is all the incentives are screwed up. And so the first thing to do is not to make unforced errors. Don't regulate a market when it makes no sense. And then don't try to subsidize the people who are hurt when it turns out that regulation takes them out of jobs by giving them excessive unemployment insurance. Have stable levels of employment at lower wages and no subsidies. And then what will happen is things will start to move up if you keep the tax burdens low. And we've not done that. And in fact, the current government, the Biden administration, is the single most irresponsible, ignorant teams of dealing with these regulations. And your governor in California and its legislature is a very close second. And so what happens is if you don't follow program. Anything that Daniel wants will not happen because the exit situation and the failure to get new immigrants coming into this country will essentially doom all of these kinds of programs. You have to open up the system first before you can fix it.
Why don't we give Daniel the last word and then open it up to questions?
So speaking directly to how should someone adjudicate in their own mind these competing claims? Partly, and this is this is connected to the theme of the course, I imagine. It's genuinely difficult to know how to adjudicate claims when partly the claims turn on contested accounts of facts, where the only way to find the facts is to spend an amount of time in archives and data sets that a person doesn't have. So that creates a real difficulty, right? So that, for example, when Richard and I disagree about whether teachers' unions have caused a decline in the performance of public school kids in the bottom half of the socioeconomic distribution, or even when we disagree about whether there has been a decline, it's going to be really hard to adjudicate that just in one's own head. So what are some good ways of thinking about it? Well, I think one good way of thinking about it is universal solutions that suggest the same instinct for all problems are unlikely to be correct. For example, it's no part of my view that government regulation is always the solution, and that government should micro-regulate. Sometimes I think it should, sometimes I think it should not. But I would mistrust a view that said government regulation is never the solution. As Richard said, in certain forms of finance and banking, you need certain kinds of regulation because of a fundamental mismatch of the incentives in the industry. That's one set of things I think are probably worth thinking about. Another question is, can people tell persuasive stories about particular examples which can be verified and which serve as illustrations of broader sets of principles? So, if it turns out that the kind of story that I'm telling about healthcare, about the fact that the problem in healthcare is not just excessive regulation, but it is also an overinvestment in the production of high-tech, high-skilled doctors who then generate innovations which can be used only by them, and thereby misallocate healthcare away from lower tech, middle-class healthcare providers who actually have a higher social product. If that story seems correct, and it's an illustration of a mechanism that I then say generalizes across other sectors of the economy, that would be a strength for the kind of argument I'm making. And if I'm unable to give that kind of an illustration, that would be a weakness.
Look, just one
Thank you.
simple observation is that many people, after 10 years, quit their high-powered jobs and they become librarians and farmers and so forth. Income is not the sole driver of people. And in fact, if you're in the finance business, unless you go on to upper management, you generally wash out at 45, which means that I've been gone from that industry for at least 36 years.
Let me invite students to come to the microphones if you have questions. And while you're doing that, let me just say that the issue, as Daniel just described, the problem of mediating between competing theories where you have data, reminds me very much of the class we had on gun regulation, right? Where both proponents, for Richard and Daniel's sake, we had John Donahue from our faculty and Eugene Volokh, who's now a colleague of Richard's at the Hoover Institution, discussing that. And I was left with the quandary, which I think Daniel has just referred to, which is, you have people arguing about data. Here you're arguing about their, complex regression analysis. And without being able to see the data and analyze the data, it's really quite hard to reach those decisions. It's easy to argue about matters of value, but it's much harder where data plays a role, and data plays a role in so many important decisions. But now over to you.
Paul, may I make just one sentence observation about this? For those who have spent a lot of time studying political philosophy, it's a fascinating defect of our liberalism that while we have an elaborate and theoretically articulate account of reasonable disagreement about values and how to handle it, that's the basic idea behind Rawls, we do not have an elaborate and theoretical account of reasonable disagreement about the facts.
Actually, in philosophy, there's a lot of literature on this. Maybe not in as much in
Not in political theory.
philosophy,
Not in political
but
theory.
yeah.
Right. In philosophy of science, we do. In epistemology, we do. But in political theory, we haven't moved that into political theory. And one of the things that this course is trying to do is figure out how to accomplish that, I think.
Yeah,
Just so.
I disagree some. I think on many of these cases, the modern tendencies is to look too heavily at the empirical evidence and not enough at the theoretical discussion of how these industries work. And so my own work tends to be in the opposite direction. And on many of these issues, I made many predictions many years ago, which I think have come to bear. And I did so on the grounds of general tendencies based on a combination of market economics on the one hand and public choice understanding on the other, rather than on the basis of detailed empirical kinds of studies. So I do think that that's another problem, is sometimes we, the way it was put to me many years ago when I started, we get reliable evidence on certain kinds of questions, but no reliable evidence of that sort on the questions that really matter.
We have a question.
Thanks for the discussion. This is a question primarily for Daniel, but for both. I understand much of your criticism about meritocracy. I'm curious about what sorts of solutions or corrections or adjustments you would foresee in society at large, but perhaps specifically in post-secondary education. How should universities behave differently if they took a page out of your playbook? What would you suggest?
Great, thank you for that. So notice when Deborah raised Ross Chetty's idea about the missing one-offs or finding people from outside the elite who are in a very strong position to compete inside the elite. I'm not against that, but my answer was that this is a prayerful mismatch with the scale of the problem. So in the university sector, in the education sector, I think, and I want to be very clear, not just for universities, but for all schools from kindergarten going forward, elite schools should massively increase their enrollments. Harvard University today spends twice as much per student per year as it did in 2000. There's no reason why Harvard couldn't educate twice or three times as many students as it does, why Stanford couldn't, why Yale couldn't, and why elite private schools couldn't. Moreover, right now, all of these elite private educational institutions are taxed effectively as charities, but they function as private clubs for the rich. And a lever to get them to do this would be to say that unless they massively increase their enrollments and draw most of the new students from outside of the economic elite, they'll lose their tax-exempt status. This would do several things. It would massively increase the supply of skilled workers. It would decrease the hyper-concentration of talent and skill at the very, very top of the distribution. It would also incidentally be good for the elite because it would make the competition to get into these elite universities less stressful and destructive for rich kids. It would reduce the gap between the top universities and the next set of universities and make for a much more egalitarian labor market once the graduates come out. And one final thought is that the flooding of the market with a large number of highly skilled but not super duper skilled new workers would induce new innovations which can make use of highly skilled but not superordinate labor. And so it would change the labor market over time in a way that favors equality. One final thought, and Richard's going to disagree with all that, but one place where you're going to agree, I suspect, on the labor market side, right now, mid-skilled middle-class labor is the highest tax factor of production in the economy. If you add together income taxes plus Social Security and Medicare wage taxes, it's much more highly taxed than most elite labor. And so there's a tax suppressor imposed on middle-class jobs. And this is not a question of what the total revenue of the government should be or what the total tax burden should be, but it should be redistributed in a way that makes it no longer the case that middle-class workers are the most highly taxed factor of production, because that will again produce incentives to employ them.
Well, there is a very, I think, valid point there, and I do share it to some extent, that Social Security taxes and sales taxes and so forth hit people with higher levels of consumption, and the rich people tend to consume less than the others, so they're out from under it. But they also suffer from other taxes, so I don't know which way it nets out. I think the general studies say it goes the other way. But let me talk about universities, having been in one. I think, in effect, that the size of a university is absolutely critical to its success. And when we were debating this at the University of Chicago, there were huge questions as to whether or not you could keep the character of the university as a powerful sort of engine for ideas if you expanded from 900 to 1,100 students. And there were people who went both ways. We did expand it, but we then basically cut down on the expansion. You want to change the number of students. It's not just getting new classes. You have to get double the size of the faculty. You have to get new housing facilities and so forth. You have to find ways in which to integrate all of these students in a series of programs which were built for much smaller student bodies. And as far as I'm concerned, what happens is if you double the size of the institution, it will be impossible for you to keep the quality of the education constant to what it had previously been. What I think what we really need to do is we need to start some new universities. The problem is, how do you start them? I'm not in favor of government starting them. I'll talk to the odd billionaire here, there, or the other place. It probably takes $5 billion to endow a university before you start getting revenues and so forth. We had some of those, it might help. If you expand other universities, it might help. But I think, in effect, that doubling the size of an elite institution means that it ceases to be an elite institution, and we have to be extremely careful. No, I don't mean elite in terms of the student body. What happens is the quality of the education will start to go down. Now, why do we spend twice as much as we did before? Again, it's a very complicated story, but there are two factors. One is that universities in America tend to become garden clubs, very strong sets of amenities, and these have increased very, very much since I started teaching 50-odd years ago, when it was much more of a bare bones operations without admitted student weekends of dinners here, there, and the other place. And, you know, students want that. I'm willing to live with that, I suppose. But the other feature is, if you look at the large research universities in the United States, the amount that they spend in compliance with new government regulations is roughly equal to the amount that they raise from voluntary contributions. And this has to do with everything you want to talk about: handicap access and regulations, the treatment and care of animals, the oversight in various kinds of review committees and so forth. And it's, again, the same story. The regulatory framework of this university is not what it was when I started teaching, and it has gotten, for the most part, much worse on this stuff, and the inability to escape it is very great. So I'll give you one illustration. What you should do if you want to sponsor research is to say, here's your total library expenses. We're going to cover 20% of it. That's not what they did. What they said is, tell us every student who uses the library for a project which is supported by the government, and then what we'll try to do is to calculate on a case-by-case basis how much the total subsidy ought to be. It costs 10 times as much to do it, and you get no information. I mean, I should tell you, I don't do it much anymore, but when I was at Chicago, I was very active for 20 years in faculty governance on virtually every kind of issue, from the hospitals to all this other stuff. And I came away from this with a very strong sense that we would do a hell of a lot better if we were left alone on most of these things, but that the compliance cost had fundamentally changed the character of the university for the worse.
You had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about maybe the bit of the timidness of the vision here in terms of response to the problem that's being diagnosed, although with different takes on the problem. You know, expanding the size of the most highly selective schools, which educate, you know, something in the order of 5% of college students. Maybe you make it 10%. This is a drop in a bucket. And if I think about, at least, Daniel, some of what you're talking about with meritocracy is all the talent and energy and contribution of people who don't get to go to elite colleges, shouldn't have to go to highly selective colleges, that there aren't enough pathways for those people to make a contribution, have a decent life, earn more than their families. So I'm just wondering why the lever here is so focused on elite higher education.
Good. So, well, Richard, you want to say something, so let me. hold
No,
on.
I want you to answer the question. I think it's a hard question.
Okay, I don't think it's timid for the following reason. First of all, I agree with you entirely that a large part of the answer has got to be that the society and the economy are restructured in such a way that a Stanford or a Yale or Harvard degree is not a necessary condition for a meaningful, dignified, stable, secure, well-respected work life. There's no question about that. The question is, how do we get there, and how big a role do these elite institutions play in what's gone wrong? And does that strike you as a fair characterization of the question?
It is, but let me give my observation.
Well,
about it.
I haven't answered it yet. I mean, okay, you go give your observation, then I'll answer it.
What happens is we do have data. For example, a study done of the kids who get into Penn and go to Penn State, right? And how do they do at a non-elite institution? Well, about the same as they would if they had gone to Penn. Why is that? Well, it's they finish higher in the class, they get more attention, and it sort of offsets the sort of general stronger common. I think the single most importantly overrated feature for dealing with students is where they go to college as opposed to what they do when they get there. And my view is what we really want to do is to help schools like Penn State, which have 39,000 students, mostly undergraduates, make their programs a bit stronger. And you could do that, I think, with a lot less distortion and lower cost than trying to take an elite institution and turn it into something which it can't do.
Okay, great. So, so a couple thoughts about that. First of all, just a very narrow thought on the Penn State data. You're right. There are these experiments or these empirical studies of people which do things like regress their adult earnings on the most elite college they got into rather than the eliteness of the college that they attended. And they show relatively small effects of where you go for that group of people. On the other hand, it's also the case that that group of people is tiny and highly idiosyncratic. So a couple of years ago, I got law school admissions officers who should not have given me this information to tell me how many students who were accepted to their law schools in the top 5 ended up attending a law school outside of the top 10. And the answer was, in the entire country, 5. And those 5 probably did pretty well at the law schools they attended. But my guess is they knew something about themselves that led them not to be representative. While I agree that obviously enormous investment needs to be made in large-scale, less elite institutions, I don't think the reason is the one you give. Now, Deborah, on your question, why do I focus on the elite? This is an empirical claim. And the empirical claim at the root of this analysis is that the ways in which the graduates of these elite universities have caused innovations, both themselves made and drawn other innovators to make innovations that remake the entire economic structure in favor of a very narrow set of elite skills, means that these institutions are in fact distorting the entire economy for everybody else. And to make that claim out persuasively requires detailed studies of industry after industry after industry, of the way in which, for example, management in American companies has been reconstructed in the shadow of the skills provided by elite business school training, which has allowed a small number of executives to strip managerial discretion from almost the entire American workforce. And if you believe that that's true and that that's the mechanism, then the structural solution is to undo that concentration of training in a narrow elite in order to remake the labor market in a new way to favor middle-class workers. And so the diagnosis is you can't solve the problem that you correctly point to without beginning in the elite. And that's why this is, in fact, a much more radical view, a less timid view than your characterization. Now, of course, I could be wrong, right? The sense of this approach turns on the correctness of the empirical claim that it's the creation of this elite workforce that has produced a series of distortions in the technology of production, which have filtered through the entire economy to exclude the remaining 90% of the workforce from a great deal of meaningful opportunity and productivity. And if that claim is not true, then the diagnosis that I'm making is of much more narrow relevance than I make it out to be.
You do not
So
have
I
a
think
long
that's
enough.
what's at the root of this. Now, just before Richard, does that seem to you to react to the question that you've asked, which is not to say that I've demonstrated what I claim I need to demonstrate. It's just to set up the problem in a certain way.
We have a student with a question here. Have you given up?
I'm quiet.
Okay, I think,
We need a louder voice.
I think we have no more questions
What?
here. I actually have a question. While we're putting up the poll, I have a question for Daniel. Tell us about 1929, the magic year.
Yeah, so look, if you look at, so two books that people should really read are a book called Oligarchy by Jeffrey Winters and The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. And these are both
Faculty member.
yes, these are both scholarly works, and the people who wrote them would not say something as dramatic as what I'm going to say. But if you summarize these books, which are systematic studies of concentrated economic power and privilege in narrow elites, what they reveal is that once a society succumbs to a certain degree of concentrated economic privilege, it becomes incredibly difficult to unravel. And the political economy of it is pretty straightforward. If the problem a society has is mass poverty, it's possible to redistribute, to eliminate or reduce the mass poverty by taking a small amount each per person from a large number of people. But if the problem a society has is concentrated economic power and privilege, the only way to reproduce equality is to divest a very narrow, very powerful elite from the source of its power and privilege. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do because the elite will hold on to it.
Not only the elite to hold on to it, their shareholders will hold on to it.
That's also possible. But the claim in those books, if you summarize the historical studies in those books, is that the only two instances or 1.5 instances in which a society successfully divested a narrow, powerful elite of its economic power and privilege is the United States in 1929 had a 1% that was about as rich relative to the rest of the population as our 1% is today, which, by the way, is more concentrated than in Imperial Rome. The other half example is Britain in 1913. The reason why that's a half example is that I think the correct understanding of what happened there is that Britain lost the First World War. And that's
let me just comment on the Depression. Yeah, I mean, what happened is this was a free fall situation. There was a massive deflation. Large numbers of very rich people lost very great amounts of wealth. It turned out that the moment we started with both Hoover on the one hand and then Roosevelt, capital gains tax at the top level went up to something like 63.5%. There was massive disinvestment in the United States. Then there was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which created things worse. And the deflation essentially created a bank crisis of one form or another, which wiped out everybody, because the way banks work is they have to have a stable dollar in order for them to be able to lend long, as they have to do in order to make mortgages, and borrow short, which they have to do for demand deposits. And everything on all of those things started to go wrong. So yes, what we did is we managed to do this, but the number of people who were reduced to stark poverty was there. And I call these Pareto pessimal solutions. Is it really a good thing to have the rich go down by 50% if the poor go down by 75%? And that's the kind of situation you have. I think efforts to make major transformations of economy without any clear sense of what the empirics are going to be, what the responses are going to be, whether it's going to be a full measure, is extremely difficult. I teach a course in land planning, most recently today, and even trying to figure out how it is that you could do something like get better opportunities for people to get educations in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. This basically has taken 50 years of failure at an enormous cost because nobody understood what the dynamics were and how the system ought to be operated. So I think, in effect, we should remember the title of Hayek's last book, which was called The Fatal Conceit, which is that there are some of us out here who know how to run a centralized economy. I view as no. decentralized economies to the extent that you could have them, create a diversification of risk and a reduction of massive error, which will in effect facilitate income. So I think in effect with everything that Daniel says, it will promise a huge decline in overall productivity and will not increase equity in any meaningful way.
So before we thank you and draw this to a close, the poll showed roughly equal numbers of participants answering the question yes and no,
So that's a big change
a pretty
from the
dramatic
initial.
change from the beginning.
So what
What
does
was the
that, which way
beginning
did
poll?
it go?
The-
More equality or less equality?
The beginning, people were more positive on meritocracy,
Oh, so I lost everybody.
and now there's more concern. You know, so there's been a definite shift of about 25%.
Yeah. So let me, Deborah and I thank both of you for giving us and our students the time. I think this was a very productive discussion. I know I learned a lot. I don't think anybody would be surprised that Richard was a longtime colleague of Milton Friedman,
Actually, a short-term colleague.
short-time colleague,
Yeah,
but
he left.
you can take the boy out of Chicago, but anyway, thank you both
I wrote
very,
my
very
PhD
much.
dissertation in the same desk at which Karl Marx wrote.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Let's give them some
Bye-bye.
applause.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Richard. Nice to see you.
Great.
Okay.